everybody, welcome to the fantasy portrait tutorial. In this tutorial, I'm bringing you along for the ride as I create a fantasy portrait, and I'll explain what I'm doing throughout the process. In this tutorial, the main focus is going to be on the character, specifically the character above the waist, so not a full body illustration since we're doing a portrait, but we also include a bit of background and some magic. So let's just jump right into it. It can be helpful when you start out to have at least a vague idea of what kind of character you're going to be drawing a portrait of, but it's not absolutely necessary. There are plenty of times where I just start randomly drawing a portrait and I kind of discover the character as I go, so that is totally fine if you want to do that. For this character, all I know is that I want to draw some sort of mage or magic user, but I don't have a specific character in mind. So to start out, I want to sketch a few random portraits at different angles, and from these portraits I can choose which one I think will have the best flow or is the most interesting. I'm sketching with the transparent watercolor brush, and I will include all of the mentioned brushes in this tutorial. I will include it in the Patreon post for you to download unless it's a brush that I bought, in which case I will include the link to where you can grab them if you also want to buy them. So I start out with a straight-on portrait and I use the symmetrical ruler. This ruler is found in the toolbar on the left. It's kind of in this little triangle shape, and when you do the settings, you just need to make sure the number of lines or sides is set to 2. That's the lowest setting, and that means there's 2 sides, and when you draw on one side, it will be reflected to the other side. And once you choose that tool, you can draw the ruler down the center of the canvas, and yeah, you will have the symmetrical ruler there in that layer, and then you just draw on that same layer and it will reflect. So this first sketch is of a male character. I know, very scandalous of me drawing a man. So his jaw and face is a little bit longer. I like this portrait, but it does feel a little bit stiff, but sometimes straight on portraits can kind of feel that way, and sometimes that's kind of the vibe you want for the character. I do still like this sketch. And it's also worth mentioning that I sketch very roughly a kind of like swoosh to represent how I think the magic could be like flowing around the character. I think something interesting could definitely be made out of this sketch, but also I want to try sketching a few more options, just so we have some more to choose from. This is also a good chance to really get warming up our hands, warming up our sketching with these little really rough, loose portraits before we dive straight into an illustration. For this next one, I want to angle the head a bit, so I start out with a rough circle and draw the head at an angle. I do generally sketch in the center line and the circle, but I don't tend to hold to it all that often. The way that I sketch is very loosey-goosey, and I don't usually make a very rigid structure for all of the proportions of the face when I sketch unless I'm really struggling. But generally, I know that the eyebrow line should rest approximately across the center of that circle of the head, and the eyes go a little below that eyebrow line. And the nose tends to rest at the very bottom of that circle. But remember that when the head is angled, like this one is angled downwards, those guidelines will shift as well. So you have to think about the circle as if it's kind of rotating down too, so that those lines, if they were like drawn on a balloon, they're also gonna rotate down. Actually, that's a really good idea to like blow up a balloon and draw the facial proportion lines across it, and just maybe do some studies even of that balloon like rotating it and tilting it at different angles. I'd never thought of doing that, but that is an interesting idea. Maybe I'll have to give it a try sometime. This is another kind of cute sketch, but I didn't feel like it flowed very well, and the angle of the head in relation to the shoulders felt a little bit awkward to me for some reason. So I kind of wanted to move on to the next sketch and see if we could come up with anything better. For the next one, I decided to go kind of in the opposite direction and have the head tilted up ever so slightly instead of down. To try and get this pose to flow a little bit better, since with the previous one I struggled with the shoulder angle, I started with a line of action. Even though this is a portrait and we don't often do lines of action for portrait, but using a line of action to get an idea of the flow of the head angle and the body still can help in a portrait and make it feel more natural. So this head is tilted slightly up and away from us. So far, even at this very rough stage, I think this one feels like the most interesting pose. The face did feel a little bit cramped, so I selected the eyes, eyebrows, nose, and mouth with the lasso tool and scaled them down ever so slightly within the head. And I just used the free transform tool, and the shortcut for that is Control T. Let's do one more and turn the head even more away from the camera without going into a full-on profile view. This one is also tilted up a little bit. Another good thing about doing multiple rough sketches to choose from is it gives you a chance to warm up your drawing and your hand before diving into the illustration, like I said. From just the beginning couple drawings to the last couple drawings, I felt much more comfortable making interesting drawings from this little warm-up. You can kind of see like the first couple start out maybe a little bit awkward or a little bit simple, and then the next couple just are much more interesting poses. And I really think that is partly, at least, from warming up and kind of getting into the groove, getting into the flow of things. So the thing about doing portraits of a character's face that is turned away from the camera slightly like this is that you do have to start thinking about how facial features overlap with each other, and it's really a chance to start honing in and testing how well you know kind of the planes of the face, because it's sort of it can be a bit of a challenge to see, okay, how does the nose overlap? How do the eye sockets actually dip in? What is the angle of the cheeks? How is the mouth angled across the front of the face? And if you are wanting to study more about the angles of the face and finding volume in the face, you should definitely check out the tutorial I have on that, on finding volume of the face and the skull. There are some interesting studies in that tutorial that are really helpful. But anyway, okay, I like the second to last one best. So that's the one I'm going to turn into a full fantasy portrait illustration. This character gives me like studious mage vibes for some reason. First, I'm going to copy the sketch over to a new canvas. This new canvas size is an A6 canvas size, which is the size that I make for Patreon prints, and that's basically the main reason that I work in this size these days usually, because I don't want to work in another size that I have to like crop or paint extra on. But an A6 size is pretty small because it's a small print, so I crank up the resolution to 1200. I know it seems like a really high resolution, and it is, but the reason I do this is because A6 is a small print, and if I someday want to make a larger print of it, I'll need a higher resolution than just 300, or even sometimes 600 if I want a really big print. Since my computer can handle it, I just take it all the way up to 1200, but if you are working on an iPad or something, it's likely that you're going to need to go a bit lower. After scaling up the sketch, I adjusted a few things in the sketch, still just using that same transparent watercolor brush. I tend to leave my sketches fairly rough and work out most of the details in the line art phase of my process. Once I'm happy enough with the sketch, I reduce the opacity of the sketch layer and create a new layer above the sketch layer to draw my line art on. I'm using the typical Krissa messy ink brush for line art here, attached to the Patreon post for you to download if you want it. When it comes to line art, I often like to start with the features of the face. I don't know that I have a particular reason for this, other than that I just really enjoy drawing the face, and I feel like it's the most important part of this piece since it's a portrait. Then I kind of work outward from the face, slowly line arting the rest of the piece. Notice that I'm not horribly concerned about having the cleanest line art ever. When you zoom out, it's clean enough, but close up, my line art can get a little messy sometimes. I feel like this is fine, and sometimes it even adds to the charming hand-drawn style. If I notice an area of line art that's too messy though, after I'm like fully in the process, it's easy enough to paint over if necessary. And also when I do line art, I sometimes try and add a little bit more line art to areas that might be in shadow, not completely blocking in the shadow with line art, but for example, some areas of the hair where the hair chunks are kind of overlapping each other, I will lay down a bit thicker lines or even maybe a little bit of hatching with the line art to help reinforce that depth. You can also see that sort of thing under the vest sleeve where it kind of overlaps with the shirt sleeve, and also under the chin. It's a principle we talked about in the line art tutorial, but also adding slightly thicker outlines versus inner detail lines can help make line weight more interesting. This is specifically an Art Nouveau inspired line art principle, but it's one that served me well over the years. So thicker outlines, thinner inlines. Once the line art is done, it's time to start blocking in the flat colors. To speed up this process, I use this ice cream cone select and fill tool that I downloaded from the Clip Studio Paint asset store. I'll include a link to it for you. If you are in Procreate or your line art has too many gaps for this to work, you can also just use the regular old hard round brush to fill paint in the silhouette of your character, just kind of manually brushing it in. It shouldn't take too long. I often do it this way anyway, but when I have the chance now, if my line art is closed and clean enough, I will use the ice cream cone tool. To use this tool, you first have to turn on the little lighthouse button for your line art layer. Then create a new layer underneath your line art layer. Pick a color to fill, and I'm just going to use gray here so that we can kind of see the darker gray silhouette. And then using the tool, draw a selection around your line art. It does a pretty good job at filling in the silhouette, but there are a few areas that it filled that I need to erase. So to do this, I just choose the bucket tool that refers to other layers, choose the transparent swatch, and then click the bucket in areas that I want to erase. Like there's a few areas where there should be gaps in the hair and I want to just erase those. Now I have changed my paper color or background color to white, and to just start adding a little bit more background color, even though I will save painting the actual background for later, I'm going to use an airbrush to brush in some blue colors along the bottom so that we don't paint on just a completely white canvas. And I'm thinking that these light blue colors will play a part in this piece. And so it's nice to at least have some sort of idea what the environment colors are going to look like before you start painting the character. Next, for the flat colors of the character. I usually start with the skin, so I pick a neutral skin color and use the paint bucket to fill my color silhouette that I created earlier. For the hair, I create a new layer and lock it to the skin layer. So since it's locked to the skin layer, if I color outside of where that silhouette is, it won't color outside. It will only show up where the silhouette is already drawn on that skin layer. Then I choose a grayish brownish color to paint in with a G-pen brush to fill in the flat colors of the hair. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the shirt. Create a new layer, lock it to the layer below, so that's the skin layer. Pick a very light blue, and with the G-pen brush, paint in the shirt. And this G Pen brush is just a Clip Studio Paint default brush. It's a hard round brush that also tapers so it's sharp. And last but not least, I paint in her vest with the same technique. New layer, locked layer below, so all the layers are locked to the skin layer, and then paint in the vest. I start by painting it a dark maroon, but I will change that color later. At this stage, it isn't the most important to have the exact right colors. We're just blocking stuff in, so what matters is that the colors are different enough that you can see what you are painting so that you don't accidentally paint over the wrong area or miss an area. Now for the eye whites and the irises. I do the same thing and use separate layers to add these colors. Now, I don't always feel the need to paint the eyes on separate layers, but since I have yet to paint in any gradients on the skin, I decided that it would be best to have the color of the eyes on separate layers for now so that I don't accidentally paint over them when I go to do the gradients. Speaking of gradients in the skin, it's time for that step. I choose a reddish color to start painting the blush. Since this character's skin is a very kind of neutral range that isn't too saturated, I also want to make sure that the blush is not too saturated. So I choose a mildly desaturated reddish color. Using an airbrush, I paint in the pink to the cheeks, nose, ears, and mouth. Next, I choose a slightly lighter and desaturated version of the skin color to very lightly paint over the jaw, neck, and chin. This area of the face tends to be more desaturated on people, plus it reflects the cool blue environment around her. And finally, I choose a slightly more yellow version of the skin tone and softly paint it into the forehead. This kind of goes along with the color mapping skin tutorial stuff that you can of course go back and watch if you need to. Now that the skin gradients are in, I want to kind of figure out the flow of the magic around this mage. I use the G Pen brush or any sharp, hard, round brush to start painting swooping abstract shapes. I toggle the transparent swatch to erase chunks out of the shapes and refine it to give it a more jagged energy. The shortcut for toggling color versus transparent in Clip Studio Paint is just C. And also, for the magic in front of the character, I paint it on a layer above all the character layers, and for the magic swooping behind the character, I paint it on a layer below all of the character layers. Once I have a rough indication of how the magic is flowing around her, I decided it would be nice to have a few stray hairs on the base color layer of the character. This is just a tiny little detail that isn't really necessary to add at this stage. I could do it at this stage, or I could save it for later during the paint over stage. Now that we have the magic in, I use a soft airbrush to paint in a gradient on the vest. It may not be 100% realistic, but sometimes I find having a soft gradient from dark to light starting from top to bottom can have a nice effect for shirts and blouses. Next, I decided I wanted to change the color of her vest so that there isn't too much red now that we have the magic in. And to do that, I use the hue, saturation, lumosity and play with the sliders until I land on something that I think works for the piece. For this one, I decided to desaturate her vest a bunch and give her almost a gray-blue sort of vest. Now it is time to start blocking in the shadows. To do that, I create a new layer and clip it to the character layers. Then change the layer mode to hard light. Next, I choose a dark grayish pink color, and the color that the shadows are tinted can change depending on the environment of the piece, remember that. In fact, they can even change depending on the location of the shadow on the character, and I'll show that a little bit later. Using the G Pen brush, I start to block in the main shapes of the shadow. We aren't doing crazy lighting in this piece, so I try and stick to a rule of top-down lighting for the most part, but this is kind of a misty scene, so the lighting is a little bit diffuse. There's no really strong light source. So I paint shadows on the bottom of the sleeve, on the neck, under the breasts. Those are all solid shadows. Then I switch to the Walter wet brush, and this is a watercolor brush, to start painting in more subtle shadows that I want to have more texture in to begin with, like areas in the face, under the eyebrows, in the eye sockets, under the chin and nose, in the hair, those types of places. I've really started taking to doing shadows with this Walter wet watercolor brush, really, because it just gives your piece a little bit more of a traditional feel right off the bat. And I find that it's kind of interesting, and also, yeah, it just gives that nice texture and is a little bit more subtle. I also use this brush to start erasing and blending the shadows in some areas like the sleeve. A way that I like to make dark line art have a little bit more warmth is by duplicating the line art, and then I lock the transparency of the duplicated line art and paint the line art red. And then I change it to an overlay layer, and then I reduce the opacity if I need to or want to, just until it kind of suits my taste. And this just gives a little bit more depth to that dark line art. I've been favoring dark line art lately instead of painting the line art different colors like I used to for some reason. It's kind of just a personal taste sort of thing. I know that some people are team paint your line art and some people are team black line art, and I started out as team paint your line art, and now I'm enjoying the darker black or almost black line art. And yeah, it's just a personal taste thing, so whatever works best for you. Okay, looking at her face now, I decided that the closest eye needed some adjusting. So I grabbed the layers associated with it. I just shift clicked the line art and then all of the shading and color layers. And then I used the lasso tool to draw around the eye and the eyebrow so that I could nudge it to the right. I also want to use the liquify to adjust some things. So now the liquify in Clip Studio works on multiple layers, so that's great. So I keep all of the color and line art layers selected, and I use the liquify to make her head slightly wider. And I also slightly shrink the eye. Now I want to refine the shape of the shadows a little bit more, especially in the hair. So I'm using the Walter wet brush again to paint some of the shadow shape. Once I'm a little happier with the shapes, I want to tint some of these shadows a little bit bluer. This is where I was talking about sometimes the shadow color can actually change depending on where on the character it even is. So we're actually going to add some of these color variations into the shadows itself. So I pick a steely blue, and using that same Walter wet brush on the same shadow layer, I lightly paint in some blue areas like the neck, under the eyebrow, and on her body. Once the basic is shading in, I realize that I haven't added gradients to the hair, which I usually do before the shading. So I go to the hair layer, lock the transparent pixels, and use a soft airbrush to paint in some color variation. The colors I choose for this variation are again somewhat dependent on the environment, but first I often like to paint in darker color closer to the roots of the hair. That's always a pretty good, given darker color close to the roots of the hair, and then lighter colors around the ends of the hair. And since this is a bluish environment, I paint cooler, lighter colors across the ends of the hair. It's also a chance to paint in some extra hair strands if you want. Now it's time to start adding a few highlights to the face. I create an overlay layer on top of the color layers and then use a light grayish orange to paint in some highlights. I like to add highlights to the eyelid, the corner of the eye, under the eye bags, in the corners of the outer part of the nose, on the top of the upper lip, and in the corner of the mouth. Then I reduce the opacity of this layer, or I erase a little bit lightly just to reduce just to make it not too prominent if I need to, if it's a little bit too much. Now is a good chance to add a few more facial details. It's also a good chance to either add or refine the little blush detail lines that I tend to draw with line art. So when I do line art of these lines, they're usually the same color of the line art, but when I paint a piece, I like to change these lines to be a bit more pink or red to blend in a little bit more with the skin. I want them to still be visible sort of, but not stand out as a really dark color against the skin, if that makes sense. And a little trick that I've been playing with lately that you're seeing here is adding a pop of bright orange or red on the edges of the line art, like here on the jaw. It's just a stylistic thing, but it helps add a bit more depth and interest to the line art, especially in a piece that has a somewhat neutral color scheme. For freckles, I like to use the droplet airbrush and tint the freckles a reddish brown. I think this airbrush is a Clip Studio default brush, but just in case, I will include it in the Patreon post for you guys to download if you need it. Usually I just color pick the skin and then I adjust the color to be slightly more red and darker for the freckle color. And I'm painting these freckles on the base skin tone layer. At this point, I was curious about what it would look like if the hair was a slightly different color. So I selected the hair layer and then pulled the hue, saturation, lumosity sliders to just see what the hair would look like at different hues. There were some interesting results, but in the end, I landed on a very similar color scheme to what I had in the first place. You know, sometimes you just gotta try out other options and see what they look like. At this point, I feel like my flat colors are working well enough, so I want to merge my flat color layers in order to keep some semblance of a clean layer palette. A clean layer panel is kind of impossible for me, but I can at least do this. I grab all of the flat character color layers and merge them all into one layer, keeping the shadow layer still separate. Let's add some more highlights, specifically in the eyes. Since I want these highlights to pop out above the line art, I create a new layer above the line art and use a light, slightly blue tinted color and a hard brush. It can take me a couple tries to get the shape that I like. Then another stylistic thing that makes the highlight pop more is I will draw a dark outline around the eye highlight. And we can't forget a cute little highlight on the tip of the nose. I want to add some more accents to the vest, so starting with a yellow or gold color, I first fill in the trim that I had already drawn with the line art. But I don't really like how the yellow looks with this piece, so I'm going to select that yellow color and use the hue, saturation, lumosity to try and get something closer to a rose gold or bronze. Before getting too far into the details, I want to add some hair highlights. So I create an overlay layer and use a lighter yellow tinted gray color to start painting in the highlights. Again, I am just using the watercolor brush for this. I paint in blobby highlights and switch to the transparent swatch with the C shortcut to refine the shape of the highlights throughout this process. With this style, I don't usually worry about realistic hair strandy sort of highlights. If I got super realistic with it, it might start looking a little bit weird and wouldn't match the rest of the character. Since I'm paying attention to the hair right now, I'm also going to take the chance to paint a bit more in the shadow layer, painting in a few darker areas in the hair and areas that I think will be reflecting more blue. Notice how putting that blue on the underside of the hair just makes it feel so much more interesting and dimensional. At least to me it does. It's from here that my whole process becomes a lot less linear and I start jumping from place to place to slowly refine the piece. So I move into the body and also add more blue into the shadows as well as darkening other areas. And then I recalled that she should probably have some indication of a back arm, so on a layer below her color layers, I create a new layer and just painted in a blocky curvy shape that would be the shape of her sleeve, and then I drew a bit of thin line art over that layer. As a fancy elf, she needs a circlet. To draw a circlet, I make a new layer above the line art layer and draw in the shape of the circlet, using the same color that was in her vest. Once I'm happy with the shape, I create a new layer and draw the line art around the circlet. To continue the red accents theme, I decided that the circlet should also have some sort of red gemstone. So back onto the circlet color layer, I paint in the gemstone, and then on the line art layer, I draw the line art of the gemstone around it. And since this circlet is metal, I want to add some color variation, starting with darker versions of that bronze color, and then color picking from the areas around, and this includes some of that desaturated teal color. Even though it's bronze, this metal would still reflect some of that blue color around it. Adding some details to the vest, I often like to draw swirly, nature-inspired designs in clothing. It adds that extra layer of detail and interest to the design, and it will also reinforce that this character is kind of fancy. So above her base color layer, but below the shadow layer, I create a new layer, and with the same bronze color, I start drawing in the designs. I just kind of go with my intuition here, not following any specific reference, but if you are having a hard time thinking of designs to draw, you can of course pull up some reference of embroidered clothing and use it as inspiration. I'm just using the rough line art brush to draw this, and I try and focus on swooping lines and curving leaf-like shapes. Most of this embroidery is going to be focused around the center of the vest, where it closes in the front and also along the edge of the sleeve. At this point, I want to do a bit of paint over to the whole character, so I am going to merge more layers. I like to make a backup of separated layers because I'm afraid of commitment. So I select all of the character color and line art layers and I group them. Control G is a shortcut for group. Then I duplicate the group and then merge that duplicated group into one layer. From there, I turn off the remaining original group and continue my work on that merged layer. Now I'm doing a bit of paint over on the merged layer, adding a bit more of that orange pop to the edge of the line art around the chin and more color variation and dark blues into the detailing of the vest. I want this bronze to seem a little bit like it's made of shimmery thread so that it will act a bit like metal, meaning that I need to add a touch of color variation. For the hair, I feel like there should be a little more texture and detail, but I don't want to go in and change the line art or shading. So to add that texture and detail, I'm going to use hatching. So I create a new layer, grab a pencil tool, and begin adding hatching to areas of the hair where there are shadow. Remember that hatching should follow the flow of the hair for the most part. Adding to this character's fanciness, she needs an earring that is also being whipped around by the force of magic swirling around her. So on a new layer, I draw the shape of the earring and then add line art around it. There's nothing too fancy about how I approach this part. It's really just me painting the earring on top of everything. I make sure to reuse that bronze and red color to keep the color repetition throughout the piece. Then I incorporate a bit of blue highlight to reflect the environment around it. And since I'm working on highlights, I also want to add a bit of highlight to the circlet and shading to the circlet as well. And for the highlight on the circlet, I like to draw a bit of a highlight that just kind of follows the edge of the circlet, especially along the upper part of the circlet. The little strings of hair behind her earring feel like they are competing a bit with the earring, so I want to lighten them a bit. To do this, I make sure the base character layer has a lock transparency toggled on, and then with an airbrush, I lightly paint a soft blue color into areas that I want to look like they are fading back into the environment a bit, like that piece of hair that's kind of next to the earring. Moving on to refining the swooshing magic around her. I could just leave the magic to be solid like it is, and it has an interesting graphic sort of style, so if you want to do that, feel free to do that, but often I like to use this watercolor brush to erase and mess around with the shapes to give it a more ethereal sort of look. If the magic is glowing at all, it will need to cast light onto the character. So I create an overlay layer and paint in some red in a few areas that I think could be affected on the character's face. You could go over the top with this, but I kind of like to keep it somewhat subtle, especially since she kind of has a diffuse lighting all around her. So a bit of red in the jawline, on the sleeve, under the nose, under the eyes, upper lip, and also I think just because it adds a pop of scariness, because red magic is scary, I also paint a bit of red across her lower eyeball, as if the eyeball is kind of reflecting the red. Moving on to starting a bit of work on the background. As a portrait, we don't need the most detailed background ever, but it is nice to at least indicate that the character is in an environment. So I'm choosing an environment that I love to paint, especially with these watercolor brushes, and that is a forest. So using a gray-blue, I start painting the vertical gnarled lines of the trees with the watercolor brush, and just building up these trees. Then I paint a bit of leaf indication using a brush from Maddie's Ghibli brush set, and I will include a link to Maddie's Ghibli brush set if you want to pick it up. Not free, and it's a Photoshop brush set, but you can import Photoshop brush sets into Clip Studio, and I do recommend her brush set. It's pretty good. But continuing to paint on the trees, I start building up the trees that might be slightly closer to the character with slightly darker slate blue colors. Notice how I'm not using any brown or green for the trees, as you might have guessed that I should. The colors that you use in your scene are really dependent on the environment and what you want to communicate. And I want to be sure that this character stands out from the background, and also notice that there's no green colors in the scene already, so it would feel really out of place to suddenly start adding like green leaves. Plus, the further away something is, the more faded and light blue-gray it's going to look, thanks to something called ambient perspective. These slate blue colors also help make the red of her magic really stand out. So on a couple layers, I build up the background and try and make it appear that some trees are closer than others. So the lighter trees look further away and the darker trees look closer. And then I use another leafy brush to add an indication of foliage at the base of the trees. I'll include the free leaf buildup brush that I have for Clip Studio Paint, but I'll also include a link to Maddie's Ghibli set as well. Once I'm decently happy with how the background is looking, I'm going to add a little bit of very thin line art. I do not want this line art to dominate the piece at all, just to help define some of the closer trees and leaves. I draw this line art on a new layer above the background painting layers. And once I'm pretty happy with how this line art looks, I actually reduce the opacity of the line art even more. Again, I don't want it to like stand out too much, I just kind of want it to help define a little bit. Now that this piece is starting to come together, I feel like the character is positioned in the piece perfectly to accommodate something like a floating magical pendant. So I sketch in a pendant on a layer above the character layer. This is a bronze metal pendant, so it should reflect the colors around it. So as I paint in the bronze color, I'm also going to lock the transparency and use a soft airbrush to paint in some of the surrounding colors so that it has sort of that reflection going on. And then for the string, I could leave it as just a string for the necklace, but I want it to be a chain. So I'm going to grab a chain brush. This is another brush I pulled for free from the asset store in Clip Studio Paint. I'll include it for you guys if you want it. The thing about this brush is that it is filled with white. So to make it the color that I want, I create a new layer, make it a multiply layer, and then lock it to the chain layer. Then I fill that multiply layer with my desired color, so this bronze in this case. And then I can paint in other necessary color variations. After that, I don't want to forget adding highlights to the metal pendant. This highlight will sweep across the pendant, and to do this, I'm just using a glow layer that is locked to the pendant layer. And it's good to know that when painting an engraved surface, I like to add a thin little highlight right along the edge of the engraving. That's where the light catches the edge and it helps make the surface look like it's indented. So this is clearly a magical pendant, so it's time to add a little magic. Using an add glow layer, I start painting in some abstract magic shapes coming off and around the pendant. Now, these shapes are not very clearly visible because they're on top of kind of a light background, so we need to darken what's behind the pendant. Using a soft airbrush and a darker red color, I paint behind the pendant to help it stand out and give it an ominous vibe and help the magic show up a little bit better. All right, it's particle time. I want to add some fine-grained particles to the magic itself to show that it's somewhat made of not just smooth magic, but there's also kind of a fine noise and particle-y bits of magic in it. Using that same particle brush that I used for the freckles, I just paint those particles within the magic and around the magic. Speaking of noise, it's time to add some of that. Clip Studio Paint has a really great library full of different size grain noise textures. So on a layer above everything, I like to add a noise or sand pattern texture. This is in the materials panel under monochromatic pattern, basic sand pattern. And the one that I like to add is the 20% 40-0 noise, but it depends on your canvas size which noise will look best, because if you have a smaller canvas, then this noise might be a bit too big for it. Then I changed the layer mode to soft light and I reduced the opacity to be quite low. The noise shouldn't be super obvious when you're zoomed out like this. It should be just enough that it adds a bit of texture, and then when you zoom in you can see it a little bit better. One of the layer steps that I love to add, especially when there are metal accessories like jewelry, is adding sparkles or flares to spots of the metal surface. I have this sparkle brush set that I pulled from DeviantArt way back in the day. I'll try and find it and link it for you because it's a really good one. And I use an add glow layer and choose a yellowish orange color and then pop in a couple sparkle accents. I think it's important to not do too many of these, just one per metal item. Some metal items could even be skipped if you have a lot of metal items already. And on that same layer, adding in just a touch of shine to the trim of the vest along the edge of the circlet and the earring. Now painting in a little bit more line designs and detail into the magic. At this point, the piece is very close to being complete, and these tiny details are mostly stylistic choices. Generally, the colors for this piece I think work quite well, but sometimes it's nice to still check with how some gradient maps look to see if there's anything interesting or if it can tie things together a bit more. So I go to Layer, Adjustment Layer, Gradient Map, and browse through some of the gradient maps to try. When I first create this layer, it is at 100% opacity and it's a normal layer, so the colors change quite a lot. Once I close the gradient map window, I can change the layer style to something like soft light, and then I can adjust the opacity to be quite a bit lower. We don't want to completely change the colors, we just want the gradient map to tint them slightly and bring the colors into more harmony. Once I have the opacity adjusted, I reopen the gradient map window and browse through some of the options to see what they look like. I found one that I like, and the effect is subtle, but it shifts things to be a little bit more purplish. To add a bit more ambient perspective to her hair, I'm going to use a soft airbrush and color pick the light blues around her to paint some of the edges of her hair that are furthest away from us. This helps add a bit more depth and ties her into this misty environment a bit more. And finally, for fun, since I get the sense that this character is not all good, let's just do a quick little trick that makes her look kinda evil. Create a multiply layer and lock it to the character layer. Using a blue color and a soft airbrush, paint over the top of her head, darkening her forehead, ears, and a bit of her eyes. To help the transition of this color, pick a slightly lighter magenta red color to paint in the transition between the blue and the area that's not painted. And that's it! We have our fantasy portrait of this character who I'm calling the Curse Crafter. I hope you enjoyed coming along this full journey with me and were able to get some insight into my workflow and some tricks along the way. Remember, I will include the brushes and stuff in the Patreon post for you to download and have links to and all of that. And the assignment / challenge for this tutorial will be posted hopefully soon. I'm thinking we'll do a draw this in your style for it. Not of this piece, but of another character that I think you guys will like. Anywho, stay tuned for the upcoming challenge, and thank you guys so much for all of your support. It's because of your support here on Patreon that I can put in the time to making tutorials like this, so thank you, and I hope you all have a fabulous day. Happy drawing, everyone. Bye!